Hello, this is Tomas Matuszak in Dwan's Comp 401 with the short of the long on the dual roles of classes. Alright, so first of all, what is a class? Well, the short of the long on that is it's basically a way to encapsulate methods and variables. So this class, it encapsulates everything related to whatever the object is that we're talking about. So let's say, for instance, a line class encapsulates everything related to what a line has, what properties and what methods a line object has. So a quick review of what methods are. Methods are these encapsulated pieces of code that may or may not return a value and may or may not accept values. So let's take a look at an example right here. We see this encapsulated code in this method, and this method, as we see, it is public int a method, and that int right there before the a method means that it returns an int value. When you call this method, it will spit out an integer value. Now the int I at the end over there in the parentheses, that is the argument that the method accepts. So you give the method this argument of integer, you give it integer, and it does something with that integer, and then it returns an integer. So in this example, we check the value of I, we either add 1 or subtract 1, and then we return the I value. Alright, so that's that. Let's take a quick look at another example of a method, and then we're going to move on. Alright, so here we have a little bit of a different example. We have public void, another method. And as you can see, it takes no arguments. The parentheses at the end are empty. And then before the another method, we have the word void. And what that word void means is that this method does not return any values. It doesn't spit anything back at you when you call the method. It just does something, and then that's it. It just finishes. We also do something else here. We create a local variable called local variable. Over there you see int local variable equals 2. And what that means is that we create a variable inside that method for the use of that method only. That variable only exists inside that method. And then after the method is done, that variable is dumped and no longer exists, and no other part of the program can use it. Alright, so that's the review. Let's move on to the dual role of classes. So there are two main ideas in how we can use a class. We can use a class as a module, which means that we encapsulate code and wall it off from the rest of the program, and we strictly control what methods and what variables can be accessed from the outside, from outside of that walled off class, that walled off piece of code. And the way we do that is we decide which variables and which methods should be public, which means available to all classes, and anybody who wants to use it can go ahead and use that method, versus whether it should be private, which is usable only internally by the class itself. So generally, you only want to make things public if they absolutely need to be public, and everything else should be private. You don't want to give the user too many privileges, otherwise problems can arise and then conflicts and hacks. So you don't want to give too many rights to any one class. You don't want to make everything available publicly. But if you do need to access something, or if you need to modify it or get the value, instead of making it public, we can make it private and then make public methods, getter and setter methods, to get the value of that variable or set the value of that variable without directly accessing that variable. So the variable is protected, but you can still modify it or get the value. So instead of making this here integer a public integer, instead we can make it a private integer and then have a public void set integer, which sets the value, and a public int get integer, which gets the value. The variable is still protected. You're not directly accessing it, but you can still modify it and get the value, which is what we want most of the time. In addition, if you want it to be a read-only integer, you can only have the get integer and not have the set integer, and that'll be a read-only variable. And the same thing with the write-only variable. You can have it only a setter method and not have a getter method, and then that'll be a write-only, but you won't be able to access the value. And so you have much more control over how the variable is accessed and what you can do with that variable. Alright, so on to the beef of this video, the difference between classes as a type and classes as a module. So a module is an encapsulation of code, and it only has one instance. There's only one instance of that module. You can only have one set of those variables, one set of those methods, and no others. If you want an identical version of that module, but with different variables, then I'm sorry, you're going to have to copy and paste that whole thing into a new class because you can only have one instance of it. And we do that by making all of the variables and all of the methods static, so they are not copyable, they can't be made into new instances of each other. So the example of a module is a ball. We only have one ball object. We can't make another ball object because it's a module, and we can only have one instance of that module. If we want another ball, we can copy and paste the entire module into a new class and call that ball2, and then we can change the variables on our own time, but we can't just automatically make new instances of it. We have to do it manually. Now a type, on the other hand, has mostly non-static variables and methods, and that way you can have multiple instances of that class. You can use it as a type to create multiple instances of that, as many as you want. So we can create multiple objects with the same code. So the only real big difference is whether things are static or non-static. So in a module, pretty much everything is static actually, and then in a type, most of the things are not static. And if they were static, if we have, let's say, if radius is static, then all of the instances of the object would have the exact same value. They would all be tied to that one value, that one static radius, that one static variable. Now, both kinds of code are reusable. They're both modular. They both encapsulate code. Now, really quickly, there's a convention in Java called a bean class. And what a bean class is, it has non-static variables and getters and setters for those variables. So our previous example of the integer with a getter and a setter, this is a bean class. Alright, so that's it for this video. The next video will be about constructors and pointers.